Taken for granted practices in rural birthing settings can reinstate, challenge, or potentially transform health inequities. Perinatal care providers can better understand the health needs of diverse populations by reflecting upon how inequitable practices are often enacted unknowingly and unintentionally. Barriers to equitable healthcare can be insurmountable for LGBTQ birthing women in rural settings. Researchers from Dalhousie and Cape Breton University have discovered new understandings of LGBTQ women's health and healthcare experiences during birth. They aim to inform how perinatal care providers can co-create equitable birthing spaces with LGBTQ women. It is important to the researchers that there is a shared understanding of the use of certain language. The researchers use a shortened version of the acronym in place of other terms such as queer or rainbow communities. Language is highly contested, and it is often difficult to fully attend to the diversity found among the LGBTQ+ communities. Thus, it is with an understanding of the complexity of language that the researchers use LGBTQ as the acronym that describes the sexual and gender identities of the participants in this study. We would like to acknowledge the generosity of the 13 LGBTQ women participants from across rural Nova Scotia, Canada. They shared powerful and heartfelt birthing stories that were analyzed through a qualitative research framework using feminist and queer phenomenology. We identified moments of tension that offer opportunities to reconstruct perinatal relationships. Study criteria were specific to people who identify as women. Insofar as transgender people with uteruses often do not identify as women, none were participants in the study. Where members of the researcher team engaged in LGBTQ studies that are not specific to the birthing experiences of those who identify as women, transgender people were an important community of consideration and inclusion. Rurality is a social determinant of health. It is an important factor in shaping healthcare practices and often influences how patients access healthcare services. The lack of knowledge around standards of care in rural settings is a critical concern. There is even less known about rural birthing practices and how they are experienced by women who are from marginalized communities. The ways in which LGBTQ women relate to others is informed by existing structures of privilege and oppression. Birthing in a rural context furthered the marginalization of LGBTQ women participants. Gaining access to equitable care was particularly challenging due to heteronormative practices. This highlights sexuality and gender identity as another determinant of health for the women in the study. Thus, the risk of accessing perinatal health care in a rural context demonstrates how the vulnerability of birth can be insurmountable for LGBTQ women. Governed by an unforgiving healthcare system, grounded in historically heteronormative and heterosexist practices, birthing can be particularly traumatic for LGBTQ women. A lack of self-awareness on the part of healthcare providers around personal assumptions and biases protected and perpetuated institutionalized dominant care practices. Estelle, one of the women in the study, shared, "It would have been a different experience if I had been given a certain level of respect. There was an overarching level of not gaining consent and of me not being the expert in my care." The women describe themselves in diverse ways, including but not limited to queer, bisexual, and lesbian. They discussed how coming out processes are shaped by heteronormative expectations and assumptions that often have different trajectories, including support and resistance from family, friends, partners, and healthcare providers. Women shared how the hospital environment reflected normative assumptions and how birthing spaces often negated, denied, and rejected opportunities to partner with difference. The complexity of identification for women was found in relationality and emotionality. Categories for LGBTQ women's experiences are often misunderstood and considered in discrete definitions. This complicates care provision for providers who are already limited in knowledge around the specific healthcare needs of LGBTQ women. It took a lot of thought, energy, agency, and negotiation of power and safety every time these courageous women came out as LGBTQ within spaces that assumed heterosexuality. The women offered narratives that allowed us to question the assumptions we make about who has legitimacy to birth and how this is a product of heteronormative cultures of privilege and oppression. Victoria, one of the participants, suggested asking patients questions that potentiate difference. She said, I guess the biggest question that they need to ask parents who are giving birth is, are you comfortable? There absolutely should be questions about sexual identity. Understandings of how invisibility further complicates the ways in which LGBTQ birthing women access healthcare services were built upon by one of the participants. Anne, in the context of the study, said, "I kind of refer to myself as the invisible queer because people here just see me with my kid and my male partner out for a walk with the dog, and they just assume that that's who I am. And so I kind of just figured that when I went into the hospital, that's who they'd see." The women had to prepare themselves each time they met with a healthcare provider. Often unconsciously and without malice, assumptions and biases that shape dominant approaches to care further marginalize historically disempowered groups. Vulnerable patients are often challenged with navigating detrimental expectations of heterosexuality. By failing to attend to difference, healthcare providers reinforce invisibility and systemic judgment. Another participant, Kate, said, "And so I felt a little disempowered and had to struggle a little bit with that, and tell myself that it was okay to ask questions or to say no or to, I felt a little bit at the mercy of the medical system." Some of the women felt lucky if they were able to access basic care services that were respectful and non-judgmental. This is not equitable care. This is merely equal care. Estelle, one of the participants, said, "So with the care provider who I liked, she just, she was very respectful of my whole plan. She didn't really bring anything up about the plan. She just kind of did her thing and sat and watched at times and just left me alone at times and asked how I was doing, asked if I wanted water, asked if I wanted a warm blanket." LGBTQ birthing women were empowered, and care was equitable when practices challenged dominant care models to bring about better understandings of how systems of privilege and oppression affect the lives of individual people. Alienation, inhibition, and distancing from non-normative expressions of female sexuality exclude LGBTQ women from a level of self-knowing and self-trust that heterosexual women take for granted. There is an increased risk of structural traumatization for the women in our study who had to perpetually come out in opposition to the expectation of heterosexuality. The women often experienced feelings of isolation, disregard, discomfort, and uncertainty, and would wonder if the silence of a healthcare provider meant acceptance of her LGBTQ status or a discomfort with it. Even if unintentional, LGBTQ women should not have to anticipate judgment from healthcare providers or risk being re-traumatized by assumed heterosexuality and heteronormative expectations. Strategies that validate experiences of structural trauma assist healthcare providers in navigating patient care in ways that respectfully attend to persons in spaces and places of difference. Participant Wynne said, "Basic compassion and respect and trust in people's right to agency was her, the healthcare provider's, basic operating system. And I think it's the most important." Women have power in their bodies to birth their own babies, and nurses have the potential to create possibilities that would empower. Providers can begin to identify opportunities to collaborate with women. Providers can learn how to support women in finding agency in places that were made invisible by practices that reinforce institutional power and control. Healthcare providers can identify and engage in moments of discomfort and conflict to create collaborative opportunities that empower LGBTQ birthing women. Teresa, one of the participants, said, "Because it makes you ask the question, Sometimes it is a little bit of that distance that we think exists. Maybe some of that is my own making, internalized homophobia, whatever you want to call it. You think people are going to reject you more than they actually do, or it comes from fear on their part, and they just need knowledge." One woman in the study described moments of discomfort and conflict as cracks in the system. Cracks are contradictions that create barriers to accessing equitable care. Cracks are points of weakness that care providers can break open. Cracks are moments of conflict that care providers must question. By looking at how birthing spaces are shaped, we can inspect how devices like rigid language can be cracked open to disrupt dominant narratives. Appreciating difference is capacity that healthcare providers can use to develop practices that are based upon non-judgment, acceptance, and trust. Thus, healthcare providers can support patients of difference in collaborative spaces of caring where they not only feel safe, they are empowered. Anne, in the context of the study, said, "She made sure to bring him down, and she sat and visited with us for a bit, telling me how cute he was and all that kind of stuff. And she just seemed to really, be very reassuring." LGBTQ birthing women sometimes created spaces where they felt safe. However, they are often easily disrupted by heteronormative expectations. Cecilia was a woman in the study who created a space that felt safe. She said, "I'm fortunate. I live in a bit of a bubble where I have a really great group of friends that are all very accepting and wonderful. I'm curious to see what's going to happen when our son starts going outside of that bubble. We need to look at the moments of tension where the two spaces meet to provide equitable care that feels safe and avoid providing basic care that feels lucky." A few women participants specifically described being protected by bubbles while others spoke about safe spaces. Whether explicitly described as such or identified in more subtle ways, bubbles were found to be important to LGBTQ birthing women. They were spaces that felt safe. Bubbles became a powerful representation of how LGBTQ women's safety was in constant threat within birthing spaces. Easily disrupting the bubbles of protection the women created for themselves, heteronormative practices carried a significant threat of re-traumatization. Therapeutic partnerships with LGBTQ women are supported by healthcare providers. They can navigate opportunities to collaborate and connect with patients of difference in ways that empower. Former sites of disempowerment have potential to be reconstructed into respectful and supportive spaces if therapeutic partnerships are built upon a shared sense of belonging, acceptance, affirmation, and trust. This would offer LGBTQ birthing women safety from the risk of being re-traumatized by assumed heterosexuality and heteronormative expectations. There is a burden on LGBTQ women to perpetually come out in opposition to the expectation of heterosexuality. Healthcare providers must do better if we are to create safe spaces and places with LGBTQ birthing women. Healthcare providers must learn to inspect the language they use in practice and work to avoid further marginalizing LGBTQ birthing women by perpetuating expectations and assumptions of heteronormativity. Renegotiations of power can allow new experiences and ways of knowing to inform healthcare providers and healthcare systems. New strategies could relieve vulnerable communities of their burden to educate healthcare providers on the health needs of diverse groups, and instead create spaces where a plurality of knowledges are acknowledged, appreciated, and respected. With the knowledge garnered from the storied experiences of LGBTQ birthing women in a rural context, relationality can be reconstructed. In so doing, power is shifted through displacing dominant care practices with the knowledge of LGBTQ birthing women. Relationships in healthcare can be reconstructed when LGBTQ women are not positioned in opposition to assumptions that reinforce systems of privilege and oppression. Healthcare providers are in a position to engage in reconstructing the coming out process with LGBTQ birthing women. Equitable perinatal care practices would better support LGBTQ birthing women in developing an inner trust and self-knowing that is both validating and empowering. Then, healthcare providers can reciprocate and provide equitable care by sharing health knowledge that is contextually appropriate. Wynne, in the context of the study, said, "My midwife was like, okay, you need to stop fighting the contractions. Feel them and breathe through them. There's a difference between bearing through it and actually giving into it." And so she was like, look at the contraction, breathe through it. It won't make the pain any less, but it will make you feel less panicked and it will be more productive. And seriously, that moment, that learning experience, and my own agency in that, and that just because I can't change the fact that the pain is happening doesn't mean that I don't still have agency, that I'm not still able to control how it affects me. Healthcare providers need to rethink relationalities and challenge the current healthcare system, offering transformative spaces and places that empower rather than diminish LGBTQ women. The team acknowledges the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Nova Scotia Health Research Foundation, the Nursing Research Fund, and the Faculty of Health Professions, Dalhousie University, for funding this research project.